I once matched with this girl that I'm still friends with on Tinder named Isabel. She seemed cool right from the bat. She had a sleeve of tattoos on her left arm, red highlights in her hair, and she had stated in her profile that she loved to work out. One of her pictures was taken on the rooftop of this cool-looking building with a sick view. I asked her where it was and she told me it was some abandoned hospital on the edge of town, which is super cool to explore at night and super easy to get into. There is usually a police officer patrolling the huge parking lot at night to deter trespassers, but she said it was super easy to circumvent. She came up with the idea of us going there together as our first date of sorts, if you want to use the word date. I was totally on board with it, and since she seemed cool and all, it seemed like a different kind of way to meet someone, as opposed to the usual, let's get drinks, cliché. I picked her up from her house 10 minutes away, and then we drove the next 20 minutes to get to the hospital. Those 20 minutes gave us a nice chance to get to know each other a bit and get comfortable with each other's personalities. When we got to the hospital, she told me to park on this dead-end street hidden by a bunch of tall bushes, which was a 5-minute walk to the inside of the hospital. We hopped this little barrier separating the road from the hospital parking lot, and then we jogged across the wide-open lot towards the grass, right next to the entrance which she said she always used. She led us to this broken window to the basement of the hospital. It all seemed kind of creepy, but I signed up for this. I was glad I wore my ripped old jeans like she told me to, because I knew I was going to rip them on something. We used our phone flashlights to look around as it was dark. We didn't bring any special heavy-duty flashlights or anything. She seemed to know this whole hospital like the back of her hand. She led us to the stairway to the upstairs. Being alone with one other person, in a place like this, at night, was very scary, but I had no idea how scary it was about to get. On the first floor, Isabel kept talking so loudly that I almost wanted to tell her to be quiet, as I was paranoid that we would be found out because of her voice. The echoes of her voice kept bouncing off the walls, back and forth and back again. It was bone-chilling to admit the least. Down the corridor we were in, it sounded like a door was opening or closing. Something echoed down the corridor to us. She heard it too and went silent. I asked her in a whisper if it was normal for others to be here, and she said sometimes, but not really. We turned off our flashlights and waited. Suddenly there was a bang much closer to us now. We both scrambled in the dark, and I followed her, barely able to see anything. We made it back to the stairway and ran up the stairs with our lights back on. When we were a couple of levels higher, we felt it was okay to speak at a normal volume again. Isabel told me the police never come in here, so it may have been other explorers, but the weird thing was there was no sign of another light in that corridor. Nobody normal would be walking in the dark like this. Then we heard sounds echoing from the exit stair shaft where we just were. Someone was coming up the stairs, and once again we scrambled. She led the way, saying she knew where to go. We ran for a few minutes through this maze of a building, and I was truly freaking out. It seemed like we were being followed, and I wasn't sure if I would rather have it been the cops or someone else. She led us to this mini outside spot. We weren't on the highest rooftop, but I guess we were on what you'd call the rooftop of this level. We stopped to catch our breath, and to be honest, the whole being followed thing was killing the vibe completely. Even she seemed concerned, and I looked at her as the expert with this place. After a few minutes we relaxed a bit and went through this broken window into the ceiling of this one large room. This part was scary because she wanted to walk along these long narrow wooden planks, with a 10-foot drop below us. A fall from this height would cause injury or even worse, death. I followed her across the sketchy, long, wooden board until we got to the top of this pillar where one board stopped and another one started. We sat on this pillar, to just chill and talk with our legs dangling over the edge, overlooking the darkness below. It was creepy in there, and I thought we were all alone until there was a sound from below us again. It sounded like someone walking. Our presence was already made known to whoever was in there, so we turned on our flashlights and aimed them down below, and right below us, standing at the pillar, looking up at us, was this middle-aged man, in a black Carhartt beanie, wearing black jacket and black sweatpants. He smiled at us and said in this creepy, deep voice, to come on down, as he was waving at us. I asked him if he was a police officer, and he disregarded my question as if he didn't hear me. He repeated for us, come on down, with his creepy smile. Isabel and I got up scared and started walking back across the narrow piece of wood. I was even more scared of falling now than before. I had no idea what that man would do to us. As we were about halfway across, the man hurried out of the room below us, through a door. He was most definitely going to try to catch us. We had to hurry in our escape, and we made it across, trying to get out of there, knowing full well that the man was dangerous to say the least. As we were running down the stairs, in the shaft on the opposite side of the hospital, we heard the door open, just a few flights above us, and then slam shut. Then we heard footsteps stomping down the steps. He somehow had followed us. We were hauling as if we were running for our lives. We made it back to the first floor, and we ran back to the opposite side of the hospital, from where we entered, and then went back to the basement and climbed through the broken window. The whole process of climbing through that window was haunting, because I went out second and I was afraid my legs would be grabbed at any moment, but I think by that point we lost the man already. We ran back across the parking lot back to my car, and when we made it, the first thing we did was lock the doors and catch our breath again. That was a complete nightmare, and somehow us getting through it together created a sort of instant bond between us. We drove away from there and stopped at a Wendy's to get food and to just collect our thoughts in the car. We later chilled for an hour, just talking, and then I dropped her off, Isabel, back to her place. I have stayed in contact through the years, and while we were romantically involved for a few months, we ended up just staying good friends, and neither of us has ever returned to that hospital. We still do not know what that man wanted, but one thing we are absolutely certain about is that he did not have any good intentions, to say the least. I've worked as a nurse in multiple hospitals and facilities before the current hospital I work at. I worked at a geriatric hospital, which was 30 minutes from my house. I had experience working with older patients before, so this was nothing new to me. I had been working at this hospital for only a couple of weeks, and you will soon understand why this was. On my second to last shift at this hospital, unbeknownst to me, at the start of that night, I was working the graveyard shifts. I was running on negative hours of sleep, and was assigned to the Alzheimer's ward. The patients in this ward absolutely adored me. My presence as a young girl in her 20s, among the residents of this ward, who were otherwise left to themselves, to float around in their minds, was maybe something that helped them momentarily feel better. I am sure they saw me as a breath of fresh air. Someone who could tie them to the now or to the everyday perhaps. If you are just left to yourself, you can mentally go to other places, which can be daunting, but with someone else in your space, you are tied to that moment in time, and I believe that can be refreshing as well. I was dealing with a number of patients that night, but one was a little more restless than the others. Her name was Shannon. This was my first night dealing with her, and she kept telling me every time I would enter her room, about the voices she kept hearing. She also mentioned about a man dressed in black, whom she kept seeing in the corner of the room. The other lady in her room requested that her curtain be closed before my shift started, so that Shannon would leave her alone. She was a sweet lady, that smiled whenever I was around her, but she didn't say much and was very forgetful. Since I started my shift around 9 p.m., most of the patients were asleep by 11 p.m., but not Shannon. Whenever she called me into the room, she would be frightened of these alleged voices she was hearing, and the man in black that kept staring at her, in the corner of the room. I'm not going to lie, it was creeping me out a little as well. I believe that in her mind she was seeing and hearing these things, and I sympathized with her because I imagine it to be very scary. Still, I tried my best to calm her down and get her to go to sleep. I did not want to turn on the TV to calm her down because I wanted to be courteous of the other patient in the room as well. I held Shannon's hands and told her that it is okay. I asked her to breathe and to relax, reminding her that she was not alone and that I was always just a call away. This seemed to do the trick. Shannon relaxed for a while, and the next time I came in the room to check, she was asleep, which gave me a sigh of relief as well. Once most if not all the patients are asleep in the ward, the night goes much slower. Time almost moves in reverse. An hour or two later, I was in the linen room stocking my cart when I heard something in the room. It was a relatively small, dead quiet room. I had the door closed as well, which is why hearing another noise was just plain weird. I turned, and I saw nothing. I resumed stocking my cart, then I felt something, which I can only describe as a hand on my shoulder. I looked at my shoulder, I jumped and screamed at the top of my lungs, but there was nothing on my shoulder. There was no one in the room, yet I knew I felt something basically grab my shoulder. I went out in the hall, for a second, to peek my head and see. No other nurses in sight, and everything was dead quiet. I had nothing else to do but to resume what I was doing and move on. I continued stocking the cart until it was full. Then just as I turned to face the door, I fell to the floor and started screaming as my heart was immediately in my throat. There was a man dressed in black, standing outside the door, looking through the glass and just smiling at me. My screams were loud enough to wake the entire ward. The man disappeared out of sight through the glass window of the door, and seconds later the door opened and one of my fellow nurses came in to help me off the floor. As I was hysterical, I asked her if she saw the man dressed in black. Her response was, "What man? There is no one else here." We checked all the rooms in the ward and there was nobody dressed in black. My screams woke Shannon from whatever light sleep she must have been in, and when I came into her room she started talking about the voices, and the screams which she did not know were my screams. I asked her about this man in black, and how he looked like. If he was smiling whenever he looked at her, and she looked at me. She was staring blackly at me for a few seconds, and then I noticed her eyebrows point down. As her expressions changed into a look, which was the most focused I had seen her the entire day, she gathered the energy, and asked me how I knew this much about the man in black. Even with my heart still racing, I felt it skip a beat as she said this. Suddenly, she started screaming to get me her out of here, and repeating over and over that he is coming to get her. The other nurses came in and tried to calm her down. I was switched to a different ward that night with someone else, and I eventually ended up going home early because I was just so freaked out. I texted the head nurse the next day that my next shift would be my last one. I also added how the experience had traumatized me and that I did not really want to be in that building anymore. I got as friendly of a response as I could have hoped for. I have never been diagnosed with anything, nor have I ever dealt with hallucinations of any kind. I am aware of the effects of lack of sleep, but this was next level. I don't know if my mind started playing tricks on me from what Shannon was telling me all night, but the feeling of the hand on my shoulder, and the image of the smiling man behind the glass door matching the description a patient kept giving multiple times was eerie creepy. This was one of those once-in-a-lifetime unexplainable supernatural occurrence. At least I hope it was once in a lifetime. I had been a doctor for 4 years, and up until the night I had to lock myself in a room with another patient, the scariest thing I ever had to deal with were the creeps that I would have to treat as a woman in medicine. This particular night though, there wasn't much healing going on in the hospital. It was more terror than anything else. It was the middle of the night and I had just started doing my rounds and checking on my patients. Most of them were typically asleep by that point, but it never hurt to just lean into the room and make sure that everything was all right with them. I made it down the hallway and around the corner after checking a few rooms, when all of a sudden, I heard something that made me drop to the floor for a second. The sound of gunshots rang out through the hospital and it sounded like they were close. I could feel my heart racing as my coworkers and the patients all started to scream. The entire hospital went into a panic and we had no idea what to do. We had done lockdowns in the past, but we never had to deal with an active shooter before. I looked around and from the ground, I could see all of the doctors and nurses running and getting down, behind any surface that they could find. I looked down the hallway and saw that most of the doors to the patients' rooms were still open. I couldn't bear the thought of them not being safe, so I took in a few deep breaths before mustering the courage to get up from my feet. My ears seemed like they were starting to ring from a mixture of screaming and gunshots around me, and with every step I took, I wanted to fall back down to the ground and just hide myself. I couldn't though. I knew I had to do something, so I kept pushing forward, and with each door that I passed I made sure to slam it close. The doors were built so that they were locked from the inside and could only be opened from the outside with the key, for security purposes, so I knew that I could keep the patients safe if I could keep their doors locked. I managed to make it all the way down the hall and closed all of the doors before I turned around and saw the gunman. I was horrified when I noticed that the hallways were practically empty with everyone hiding, and it was basically just me and the shooter in the hall. I don't think he noticed me right away though, and I ran right into the room that was next to me before closing the door as gently as I could. I hoped that the man didn't see me. As I turned and saw a young girl in that room with me, she was in her bed with tears in her eyes, so I rushed over to her bedside and reassured her that everything was going to be okay. The gunshots continued as the man made his way down the hallway, and with each one came countless screams from around the hospital. I decided that the safest thing for us to do was to get the girl out of the hospital bed and over to the small closet that sat in the corner of the room. If I could hide her away, I figured that even if the gunman came into the room, he wouldn't find anyone other than me. I sat her in the closet and told her that it was all going to be fine, and then I wheeled the hospital bed so that it was blocking the door to the room. I cringed with each gunshot that rang through the halls, and with each one it sounded like they were getting closer and closer. It felt like an eternity passed before there was finally silence in the hallway. I didn't know what was going on by that point and was worried that the man was still in the halls with his gun. I thought that maybe he was just reloading, but then I heard the sound of multiple sets of heavy footprints and was relieved when I realized that the police were finally on the scene. Once the police got there, he ended up surrendering himself to them, but protocol dictated that we stay in the room until the police came to the door and reassured us that it was all fine. That didn't happen until about 10 minutes after I heard the police apprehending the man, but when it did, I made sure to pull the patient out of the closet and got her situated back into her bed. I gave the officers my statement, and when they explained exactly what happened, I realized just how close I almost was to losing my life and many others. The officers explained to me that the shooter started near the entrance to the wing, which means that if I hadn't started my rounds on time, I would have been the first person that he would have seen when he started shooting. Who knows what would have happened if I wasn't able to lock those doors for those patients in time. Three years ago, I contracted bacterial meningitis. I live in South Florida. I don't believe there was an outbreak going on or anything, so I'm not sure how I caught it or who I could have caught it from. I started developing really bad symptoms. Painful headaches, confusion, sleepiness, nausea, and lack of appetite, but when the hallucinations started, that's when I knew I had something really serious. Laying sick in bed while my husband was at work, I heard a child's voice call, "Mom," from downstairs. For context, we don't have any kids, so I found it to be very weird. I dragged myself out of bed to look down the stairway. I called my husband's name, and when I got no answer, I realized, of course he could not answer because he was at work. I chuckled at this realization, and started walking back to my room. The headache I had from standing was too much, so I went back to bed. For a second time, I heard a voice call from downstairs. This time, it said hello. I picked up the phone and called my husband, freaking out to him into the phone, that I was hearing a scary child's voice from inside the house and that I thought I was hallucinating. He heard how distressed I was over the phone, and so he left work early to bring me to the hospital. While waiting for him to get home, I changed out of my pajamas, and while doing so I had to run to the bathroom to throw up. As I was midway in throwing up, I heard another voice. This time it was coming from outside of the bathroom. I couldn't hear what it might have said, nor could I tell if it sounded the same as the other voices I heard before. I was losing my mind there and then. I wasn't diagnosed until I arrived at the hospital, and apparently, if untreated, that I had could be very serious or even fatal. The doctor told me the hallucinations part was rather unusual but not unheard of. I was given antibiotics through a needle. Shortly after I arrived at the hospital with my husband, the doctor told me that I was fortunate to have come to the hospital so quickly, as if I had waited much longer this could have had lasting effects or possibly have been fatal. My husband stayed with me for a few hours in the room. I was told I was going to have to stay there for a few days to a week given the severity of my symptoms. Around 10 p.m., my husband left to go home as he had to go to work the next day. The nurse told me to call her if I should have any issues or if I needed something. Though I still felt like absolute death, I nodded off pretty quickly. I started having this dream where my ex-husband was in the room, over my bed, looking down at me. He was saying horrible things about my current husband. He patted my head and said he was glad I was okay and that he came as soon as he saw my husband left. He went into this rant about how he despises my current husband and wants to kill him. He kept rubbing my forehead, and then left the room. I often have bad dreams about my ex-husband because of how toxic and abusive our marriage was, which is why it ended. I woke up in this drowsy, lightheaded state and looked around the room. There was a chair pulled up in front of my hospital bed, but no one was sitting in it. It wasn't like that when my husband left. It was still the middle of the night, so I went back to sleep. I woke up the next morning to the nurse in the room. I told her about the weirdly vivid dream I had, and she told me that it wasn't a dream. She said my cousin came to visit me last night while I was asleep. I told her that I did not have any cousins that live in the state. She looked more serious now and said someone came in and said they are your cousin. She went on to say that David visited me late last night. David was the name of my ex-husband. After explaining, the nurse got a doctor, and the doctor told me the antibiotics may have caused delirium, which hindered my ability to recognize sleep from wakefulness, hence why I was so vividly hearing what David was saying. I called my husband to tell him what happened, and of course he was livid and concerned. He came back again that night after work, but that day I texted David asking what the hell he was thinking, visiting me, and how did he know I was in the hospital? My text delivered, but he ignored it. I sent a follow-up text telling him I heard all of his threats towards my husband and that I would be getting police involved. Minutes later, he responded saying he never made any threats towards my husband, and that he was simply there when he heard what happened, just to make sure I was okay. He further went on saying I must have heard things in my sleep. I responded blatantly telling him to stay out of my life or I'll get the police involved. Again, he didn't respond after this. I never told my husband about the threats that I heard in my drowsy, half-asleep state because I didn't know if they were real or not. With a mix of the antibiotics in my system and having those weird, audible hallucinations that day, I didn't think it was impossible that what I heard wasn't actually what was said by David, but I could be wrong as well. I left the hospital the next week and have not had any hallucinations since. What were the voices I heard in my house? I still do not know to this day. The worst part about growing up for me was the kidney issues that I had as a teenager. I was in and out of the hospital, at least once a year, and more often than not I was always there for multiple days depending on the procedure. One stay that I could ever forget though was when I was 17 years old. I had a small surgery scheduled for early in the morning and the doctors wanted to monitor me overnight, so naturally I spent the night in a hospital bed. Everything was pretty normal for me at least until around 10 or 11 p.m. I was trying to get some sleep before my procedure, but for some reason I couldn't get comfortable. Suddenly, I heard the sound of laughter, and at first, I thought it was one of the patients that were down the hall from me. Maybe they were watching something funny, but then I noticed that the laughter was getting closer and closer. I looked out towards the hallway and before I could even consider the idea that maybe it was a doctor or nurse laughing, I started to hear the sound of someone running away. It was then that I saw someone running by the door so quickly that I could hardly see who it was. All I could tell was that they were wearing a hospital gown just like me. The haunting laughter faded as they ran further down the hallway. I brushed it off and just assumed that a nurse at the nurse's station would likely see them and get security involved. I was surprised though when I heard that same high-pitched and almost sinister laughing coming from down the hall again. It was coming from the opposite direction this time, as if they had turned around and were not running back the way they came. I made sure to make it seem like I was sleeping as the person ran past my room again. I couldn't keep up the charade for long though, and my eyes sprang open when it sounded as though the person stopped right outside my room. I looked at the door and could see that they were still in the hallway, but they definitely didn't make it far. The laughter was louder than it had been up until that point. I grabbed the remote and pushed the button to call for a nurse, but got concerned when they didn't show up as fast as usual. Thankfully, after a tense minute of waiting and wondering if the person was going to move or not, I heard one of the nurses' yells from the hall. They called out as they noticed the laughing man. He took off running and the nurse came right into my room, to make sure I was okay. I explained what happened and they apologized and said that the patient that I saw was actually an addict who had gotten into an accident and was experiencing forms of psychosis due to his withdrawal. She assured me that security was notified and that they would apprehend him and get him back to his room as soon as possible. I tried to settle down over the course of the next couple of hours, but I wasn't able to get any sleep until about 3 hours before my surgery was scheduled. I eventually managed to drift off, and as I was probably only asleep for about an hour though before I was woken up by another strange noise. This time it wasn't the laughter though. My eyes opened to the sound of someone pacing around the edge of my bed, and as soon as they realized I was awake, the patient who was running through the halls rushed over to the side of my bed. I tried to lean away from them, but I could only lean so far. The man's eyes were wide open, and I could tell by the look on his face that he wasn't fully aware of what he was doing. "You told," he yelled at the top of his lungs. I was frozen. I couldn't move at all. I was so scared, I almost felt like I was paralyzed. He continued to yell over and over again saying that I told them, and each time he kept putting his face closer and closer to mine. Finally, I managed to let out a cry for help, and I hoped that a nurse or a doctor or even a member of security would hear me. The man was taken aback by my screams, and my eyes couldn't help but notice that he had curled his hands into tight fists as if he was getting ready to attack me. Thankfully, before he could do anything like that, a security guard came running into the room and managed to subdue the other patient. The doctors and nurses apologized for my terrifying night, but all I wanted was to get my surgery done and get out of that place as fast as I could. Within my first few years of being a doctor, I learned that there's not a lot that people won't do to try to scam drugs out of the hospital. I have had people pretend to have broken bones or fake wounds to try to get painkillers, but most give up after realizing that they aren't getting anything other than high-grade naproxen or Tylenol. It is not always the case though. I'll never forget the night that a man who looked like he was around my age, came in claiming that he was having back pain. Now I believed him that the pain was real and was fully ready to admit him and get him some pain relievers, but I noticed a grimace appear on his face when I told him that I would give him an anti-inflammatory to hold him over until we ran some tests. He asked me if I was joking, and when I assured him that I wasn't, he started to raise his voice. He called me names and eventually even stood from the bed and walked over to me, as if he was about to hit me. I tried to calm him down and explain that once we figure out what was wrong with him, we could give him anything that he needed, but apparently, he needed his fix right then and there. As I was trying to calm him down, I noticed him slowly pulling something out of his back pocket. I put my hands up, in between us, and took a step back, as soon as I noticed that he had a knife in his hand. In a downward motion, he flipped the knife, so that the blade would come out, and then he pointed it at me. He demanded I give him what he wanted, as he stepped towards me. I gently told him that he didn't need to get violent and that we could talk about it and get him the help he needed, but he didn't want to hear it. "You make any moves, I'll kill you," he said coldly. The man pushed my hands aside and then turned me around before pressing the knife into the middle of my back. He told me that we were going for a walk and then began ushering me out of the room, toward the elevator. He whispered to me, telling me to take him to the pharmacy before pressing the point of the knife into my back a little harder, to remind me what he would do, if I didn't listen. The elevator door opened, and we stepped inside. It took us to the floor that the pharmacy was on, and all I could do was hope that no one got onto the elevator with us. The last thing I wanted was for anyone else to be in danger. I cooperated with the man and walked him right up to the pharmacy counter just like he asked, but I knew that they were not just going to give me the drugs that he wanted. I tried to stall the man before he became unruly, in hopes that someone would come to my assistance. Thankfully, as I was explaining to him that we just had to wait and get the proper forms, I heard him let out a grunt. I turned around and saw that the security guard had managed to get the man onto the ground and the knife away from him. We called the police and had the man arrested. I profusely thanked the security guard, who told me that he suspected something was wrong as he happened to be walking by when the man forced me onto the elevator. He rushed downstairs and quietly snuck up to the man with the knife and managed to save my life.